Adrian Cole paced the length of the long, cool marble chamber. This was supposed to be the moment humanity could finally move forward. But now that the war had ended, the air still felt thick with hostility. He cast a glance at the alien delegation clustered near the room's far end. The Thalera were as elegant as their ships, all sharp features and graceful, elongated limbs. Their Empress, Cerelia Vetherin, stood apart from her council, observing the human delegation with eyes that seemed to pierce through skin and bone. Her presence was magnetic, yet unnerving. "Still think this is a good idea, Captain?" His second-in-command, Lieutenant Mark Hansen, muttered at his side. The younger officer's eyes flicked toward the Empress. "I mean, look at her. She's not exactly giving off peace and love vibes." Adrian folded his arms. "It's not about vibes, Hansen. It's about the fact that neither of our sides can afford another war. If a treaty keeps everyone from killing each other, we'll take it." Mark chuckled, a bitter edge to his voice. "Sure. Until one of their admirals decides they didn't get enough compensation and starts shooting again. That's why we're here, to make sure that doesn't happen." Mark leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You really think she's going to just sign a piece of paper and let bygones be bygones? We've been blowing each other up for years. She probably sees us as, I don't know, pests." "She sees us as survivors," Adrian corrected. "And maybe as equals. She's no fool. The Thalera have had to face losses too." Before Mark could reply, one of the Empress's advisors stepped forward and announced, "Her Majesty will now address the human delegation." Adrian felt his pulse quicken as Cerelia began to speak. Her voice was smooth and measured, with a faint melody in its cadence. "We stand here on the ruins of a conflict that has left both our people scarred. While the fighting has ceased, the wounds will take time to heal." Mark leaned over, muttering under his breath. "Wounds? That's one way to put it." Adrian silenced him with a glance. He was focused on every word the Empress spoke. She wasn't just reciting prepared lines. There was a conviction, a drive behind her words. She went on to acknowledge the sacrifices made by both sides, the need for trust, and the shared responsibility of ensuring peace held. When she concluded, Adrian felt the room exhale. There was a brief silence, followed by the soft hum of translated murmurs. The human delegation's leader, Ambassador Kieran Lawson, stood and approached the central podium. The people of Earth recognized the courage it took for the Thalera to extend their hand in peace. "We stand ready to forge a new path, together." Cerelia inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. The assembled Thalera murmured amongst themselves. Adrian, however, caught the faintest flicker of something in the Empress's eyes. Was it skepticism, or perhaps something deeper? Curiosity. When the formal proceedings adjourned, Adrian and Mark found themselves in the vast hall outside the chamber. Mark looked unimpressed. "That went about as well as expected. Lots of pretty words, no guarantees. I give it a month before someone messes it up." Adrian leaned against a polished pillar, rubbing his temples. "You could try being a little more optimistic." "Yeah, and pigs might fly." Mark crossed his arms, then hesitated. "All right, so she was different from what I expected." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Mark shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. Less alien, I guess. I mean, she's still an alien, obviously. But she wasn't as cold as I thought she'd be." Adrian nodded slowly. "She's a leader. She knows what's at stake. And she knows we aren't just going to roll over." Mark snorted. "You got that right. I'd like to see them try." As they spoke, a Thaleran diplomat approached. "Captain Cole, Her Majesty requests a brief word." Adrian's eyebrows shot up. "With me?" "Yes, privately." Mark leaned in. "What's this about?" "Guess I'm about to find out." Adrian stepped away from his second-in-command, following the diplomat down a quiet corridor. They stopped before a heavy, ornately carved door. The diplomat gestured for him to enter. Adrian pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was far smaller than the grand chamber, intimate almost. Cerelia stood by a large window, looking out at the endless expanse of space. When she turned to face him, her expression was unreadable. "Captain Cole," she said, her voice softer than before. "You carry yourself differently from the others." Adrian inclined his head. "I'm not here to play politics, if that's what you mean." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Exactly. You are here because you believe in something. I find that intriguing." He tilted his head. "And you? What do you believe in, Your Majesty?" She studied him for a moment before replying. "I believe that the war has taken too much from us all, and I believe there are more productive ways to interact than through violence." Adrian was struck by the sincerity in her tone. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder what kind of person she truly was beyond the title and the formality. The war had defined her, just as it had defined him. But now that it was over, perhaps there was a chance to find something new, something neither had expected. "Maybe we're not so different," he said quietly. "At least in what we want now." Her gaze lingered on him, and she nodded once. Perhaps not. For the first time since the treaty was signed, Adrian felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years. Hope. Chapter 2. A commanding presence. Adrian straightened the lapels of his freshly pressed uniform as he waited outside the Thalaran council chamber. Mark stood beside him, bouncing slightly on his heels. The younger man had a way of fidgeting that made Adrian's nerves flare. "Cut it out," Adrian muttered. Mark glanced over, raising his eyebrows. "What? I can't help it. This whole situation feels." He lowered his voice as a pair of Thalaran advisors passed by. "It feels strange. I mean, we were fighting these people not that long ago. Now we're just supposed to cooperate." "That's the idea," Adrian replied. "Unless you'd prefer to go back to the trenches." Mark sighed. "No. I just wish I knew what to expect." Adrian didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to expect either. His previous encounters with Empress Aurelia had been formal and guarded, and now he was tasked with navigating Thalaran court politics on behalf of Earth. He couldn't deny the weight of the responsibility or the unease that came with it. The chamber doors opened, and a Thalaran official emerged. "Captain Cole, Lieutenant Hansen, Her Majesty will see you now." Adrian exchanged a glance with Mark before stepping inside. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with shimmering silver panels that reflected faint, shifting light. The Empress sat at the head of a long, curved table, her presence commanding yet somehow distant. Her advisors flanked her, their gazes steady, their expressions unreadable. Adrian offered a respectful nod. "Your Majesty." Aurelia inclined her head. "Captain, please have a seat." Adrian and Mark took their places at the table. For a moment no one spoke. The Thalaran advisors remained silent, their large, black eyes fixed on the humans. Aurelia folded her hands on the table, her long fingers intertwined. "I understand that Earth has concerns regarding the resource distribution outlined in the treaty," Aurelia said, her voice calm and deliberate. "We do," Adrian replied. "There's been some confusion about how those resources will be allocated and transported. His team has been looking into the logistics," Mark interrupted. Adrian shot him a warning glance, but Mark pressed on. "It's not just about moving goods. We need to ensure the process is secure and fair." Aurelia's eyes flicked to Mark, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "A valid point, Lieutenant Hansen. Security is of utmost importance." Mark blinked, surprised by her direct response. Adrian cleared his throat. "We've identified a few bottlenecks in the supply chain. I believe a joint task force could address those issues more efficiently." One of the Thalaran advisors leaned forward. "A joint task force? Are you proposing that Thalaran and human personnel work side by side?" "That's exactly what I'm proposing," Adrian said. "If we pool our expertise, we can streamline the process and avoid unnecessary delays." The room fell quiet again as the advisors exchanged subtle glances. Aurelia regarded Adrian, her expression thoughtful. "It is a logical suggestion," she said finally, "and one that would foster greater cooperation between our peoples. However, Such an arrangement would require careful oversight. I'm willing to oversee the human side, Adrian offered. I'm confident we can make this work. Mark leaned in slightly. And if there's any way we can expedite the initial shipments, that would help smooth over the concerns back on Earth. Sorelia turned her gaze to Mark, studying him with an intensity that made the young lieutenant shift uncomfortably in his seat. You seem quite eager, Lieutenant. Mark hesitated. I just think it's important to keep momentum going. Indeed, Sorelia said, her tone even. Momentum is crucial. Adrian noticed the way she looked at Mark, as though she were assessing him, weighing his words and his character. It was something Adrian himself had experienced in his early conversations with her. She had a way of cutting through pretense, of seeing what lay beneath the surface. It was both unnerving and strangely compelling. Very well, Sorelia said after a moment. I will authorize the formation of a joint task force. Captain Cole, you will coordinate with my advisors to outline the initial framework. Lieutenant Hansen, your enthusiasm is noted. I trust you will support your captain in this endeavor. Mark straightened. Absolutely, Your Majesty. Good. Sorelia rose from her seat, and the advisors followed suit. Let us hope this partnership proves fruitful. As the meeting concluded, Adrian and Mark stood and prepared to leave. Just as they reached the door, Sorelia spoke again. Captain Cole. Adrian turned back. Yes, Your Majesty? She regarded him for a moment before nodding. You have a directness I appreciate. I expect you to maintain it. I will, Adrian promised. Thank you, Your Majesty. Outside the chamber, Mark exhaled loudly. Well, that wasn't too bad. I think she liked you. Adrian smirked. She liked my plan. Don't read too much into it. Sure, Mark said with a grin. But I bet she's got her eye on you. Adrian shook his head. Let's focus on the task at hand. We've got a lot of work ahead. Whatever you say, Captain. Mark's tone was light, but his words lingered as they walked down the gleaming corridor. Chapter 3, Negotiation Games. The Thalaran Festival Hall was a swirl of sound and color. Alien orchestras played hauntingly beautiful melodies on stringed instruments that shimmered with a golden sheen, and dancers moved in intricate, fluid patterns, their long, jointed arms creating shapes that seemed to defy gravity. Adrian stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling out of place amid the grandeur. Mark, as usual, stood close by, his mouth slightly open as he took in the scene. Okay, Mark said after a moment. I'll admit it, this is pretty amazing. And weird, but mostly amazing. Adrian chuckled softly. Not quite what you'd see at a human banquet, that's for sure. Mark gestured toward the performers. Those dancers, they're like liquid. How do they move like that? No idea, Adrian replied. But I'd guess centuries of practice. Mark turned to him, smirking. Maybe you should try a few moves, Captain. Loosen up a bit. Not a chance, Adrian said, though he couldn't help but smile. I'd rather not make a fool of myself in front of half the Thalaran nobility. Fair enough. Mark turned back to the performance. Still, this is a nice change of pace. No tense meetings, no glaring advisors. Just culture. Yeah, Adrian said quietly. But I doubt it's that simple. There's always something more going on. Mark arched an eyebrow. Like what? Like this festival, Adrian said. It's not just a celebration. It's a political statement. They're showing us their traditions, their art, their identity. It's a way of saying, this is who we are. Mark tilted his head, considering. I guess I can see that. But it's not a bad thing, is it? No, Adrian admitted. It's not. It's just something to keep in mind. As the dancers finished their routine, the crowd applauded with a clicking sound that reminded Adrian of snapping fingers. He followed Mark as they moved toward a long table laden with what he assumed were Thalaran delicacies. Brightly colored fruits glistened under soft lights, and steaming dishes emitted aromas that were foreign but not unpleasant. Mark picked up a small, violet sphere and held it up to the light. What do you think this is? Probably best not to guess, Adrian said. Just try it and see. Mark popped the fruit into his mouth and chewed thoughtfully. Not bad. Tastes like mango? With a hint of cinnamon. Adrian tried a piece himself and nodded. I see what you mean. As they sampled the food, Adrian felt a presence nearby. He turned to find Empress Cerelia standing just a few steps away, her expression unreadable as always. Her shimmering gown caught the light, and for a moment, Adrian thought she almost seemed relaxed. Captain Cole, she said, her voice softer than it had been during their formal meetings. Enjoying the festival? Adrian nodded. It's fascinating. The music, the food. It's all very different from what I'm used to. But I can see how much it means to your people. Cerelia's lips curved into the faintest smile. Our cultural heritage is something we take great pride in. I'm pleased you find it interesting. Mark stepped forward, holding up another piece of fruit. What's this one called? Cerelia glanced at the fruit in his hand. It is called Vicheria. It is known for its balance of sweetness and spice. Mark grinned. Balance, huh? That's a good word for it. The Empress regarded Mark for a moment before her attention returned to Adrian. Your people must have similar gatherings. Celebrations of your own history. Adrian nodded. We do, but not like this. Earth's cultures are more fragmented. Each region has its own traditions, its own way of marking important events. We don't have a single unifying festival like this one. Perhaps that is what makes humanity so intriguing, Cerelia said. You are diverse, yet you find ways to come together when it matters most. Mark chimed in, yeah, we're like a bunch of puzzle pieces. Messy, but we fit together somehow. Cerelia tilted her head, as though considering his words. A puzzle is an apt metaphor, one that speaks to the complexity of your species. Adrian felt a flicker of warmth at the almost playful tone in her voice. This was a side of Cerelia he hadn't seen before, a glimpse of the person behind the crown. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but he decided not to overthink it. Instead, he gestured toward the table. Do you have a favorite dish here? He asked. Cerelia's eyes flickered with amusement. If I told you, it would no longer be a secret. Mark laughed. So it's like that, huh? All right, we'll let you keep your secrets. But don't be surprised if we guess. Cerelia's lips quirked into a smile. I shall look forward to seeing how close you come. Adrian met her gaze, and for a brief moment, he felt the tension that had always been present between them start to ease. It was subtle, but it was there. A shift in the air, a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as different as they'd thought. Chapter 4: Bonds Across Worlds. The courtyard was tranquil, save for the gentle hum of a fountain in its center. Lights glowed softly along the edges of the tiled path, their illumination just bright enough to highlight the flowers, vivid bursts of crimson, gold, and violet, planted in meticulous patterns. Adrian sat on the edge of the fountain, gazing at the sky above, a tapestry of stars that seemed impossibly close. Mark stood nearby, leaning against a stone column, hands in his pockets. Hard to believe, Mark said, his voice low, that this is where we are now. Adrian glanced over. What do you mean? I mean, a few months ago we were on the front lines trying not to get blown to bits, and now we're here. Mark gestured vaguely at the garden. Having polite conversations, eating weird alien fruit, listening to their music. It's like a dream. Not exactly a dream, Adrian replied. But I get what you're saying. Mark shifted his stance. You ever think about what would have happened if we'd lost? All the time. Adrian ran a hand through his hair. I think about what we would have lost. Our homes, our families, everything. And I think about how much we've already lost. It's hard not to. Mark didn't reply right away. He stared at the fountain, his brow furrowed. It's just, this place, these people, they're not what I expected. How so? Mark shrugged. I guess I thought they'd be, I don't know, more different, more alien. But the more I see them, the more I realize they're just people. They have families, traditions, dreams, just like us. Adrian nodded. Yeah, that's something I've been realizing too. Mark pushed away from the column and came to stand next to him. You think this peace thing will stick? It has to, Adrian said simply. There's no other choice. They fell into a companionable silence, the fountain's gentle flow filling the gaps in their conversation. After a while, Adrian caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Turning his head, he saw Empress Cerelia approaching, her steps light on the tiled path. Her silver robes shimmered faintly in the soft light. Captain Cole, Lieutenant Hansen, she said, her voice smooth and even. I hope I am not interrupting. Not at all, Your Majesty, Adrian said, standing. What brings you here? I often walk these gardens at this hour, Cerelia replied. They are quiet, a place where one can think. Mark gave Adrian a subtle look, then offered a polite nod to Cerelia. I should probably head back. Captain, I'll see you in the morning. He walked away without further comment, leaving Adrian and Cerelia alone by the fountain. Your lieutenant is perceptive, Cerelia remarked. Adrian chuckled. He has his moments. The Empress stepped closer, her gaze sweeping over the garden. I find it curious, Captain, how often humans and Thalera reach similar conclusions despite our different perspectives. Adrian crossed his arms. You're not wrong. The more I talk to your people, the more I realize we're not as different as we thought. Perhaps that is why this piece has a chance to succeed, she said. Understanding is a powerful tool. Adrian nodded. It's not easy, though. There's a lot of history to overcome. Cerelia turned her head, her deep eyes meeting his. There is always history. What matters is the path we choose to walk next. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, yet calm. Adrian looked away first, his gaze returning to the fountain. I guess we're both walking new paths. He suffered. I regret the pain that has been caused. But this moment, this opportunity, it is something I cannot regret. Adrian studied her for a moment. I think I know what you mean. Cerelia's lips curved into a faint smile. You are more thoughtful than most humans I have encountered, Captain. It is unexpected. Adrian chuckled lightly. I'm full of surprises, Your Majesty. I am beginning to see that, she said, her tone warmer than before. They stood in silence for a moment longer, the fountain's soft murmur the only sound. When Cerelia finally spoke again, her voice was low, almost contemplative. We have much to learn from one another, Captain. Perhaps more than either of us realizes. Maybe so, Adrian agreed. But we've got time to figure it out. Indeed. Her gaze lingered on his for a brief moment before she stepped back. I will leave you to your thoughts. Good evening, Captain Cole. Good evening, Your Majesty. As she walked away, Adrian watched her go, a faint smile on his lips. The garden felt a little brighter, the night a little less heavy. Chapter 5. Confessions. The Thalaran starship was unlike anything Adrian had ever seen. The walls seemed to hum softly with a faint light, and the air carried a subtle metallic tang. The corridors were wide and smooth, curving gracefully into rooms filled with softly glowing panels. Adrian and Mark stood side by side in the main observation deck, gazing out at the starfield that stretched beyond the ship's transparent walls. Mark leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the smooth metal rail in front of him. It's incredible, isn't it? The view from up here. Not just the stars, but the way everything feels. So seamless. Adrian nodded, his eyes fixed on a distant nebula that shimmered in shades of gold and blue. It's impressive. The Thalera have a knack for making things elegant and functional at the same time. Mark grinned. Makes our ships look like old freighters, huh? Adrian chuckled. Maybe just a little. As they spoke, the door behind them opened with a soft hiss. Adrian turned, expecting to see another Thalaran officer, but instead, Empress Cerelia stepped into the room. She moved with her usual grace, her silver and green robes flowing around her as though they were part of her. Captain Cole, Lieutenant Hansen. She greeted them, her tone measured but not unkind. Your Majesty, Adrian replied with a respectful nod. Mark quickly followed suit, offering a somewhat stiffer bow. Cerelia's gaze swept the observation deck before she approached them. I hope the accommodations aboard our ship have been satisfactory. They're more than satisfactory, Adrian said. This ship is… well, it's something else. Good, Cerelia said with a slight nod. I would not wish for my guests to be uncomfortable. There was a moment of silence, during which the three of them stood at the railing, looking out at the endless expanse of space. Then Mark cleared his throat. I should probably check on that report, he said quickly, excusing himself. Captain, Your Majesty. Adrian glanced at him, recognizing the excuse for what it was, but he didn't object. Go ahead, Lieutenant. I'll handle things here. Mark gave him a subtle look as he left, a mixture of encouragement and amusement. Once the door closed behind him, Adrian turned back to Cerelia. I take it there's something you wanted to discuss, Your Majesty? Cerelia tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. There is. I wanted to speak with you privately, away from the formality of our official meetings. Adrian raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected. What's on your mind? Cerelia hesitated, her gaze shifting to the stars beyond. In my position, it is rare to speak candidly, but I find that you do not approach me with the same wariness as others. It is both intriguing and, perhaps, refreshing. Adrian leaned on the rail, watching her carefully. I guess I'm just not very good at pretending. I try to say what I mean, even if it doesn't always go over well. I have noticed, Cerelia said, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips, and I appreciate it. Your honesty cuts through the layers of pretense that often surround me. It is unusual. Unusual isn't always a bad thing, Adrian said. Sometimes it just means we're looking at things differently. She studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. You do look at things differently. It is one of the reasons I find myself speaking to you now. Adrian wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't accustomed to hearing such a personal admission from someone like her, someone who had been an enemy not so long ago. Finally, he broke the silence. You said you wanted to speak candidly. What's on your mind, Cerelia? She turned her head, meeting his gaze directly. The use of her name, without a title, didn't seem to faze her. If anything, it softened her expression. I have seen many humans over the years, she began slowly. Soldiers, diplomats, prisoners of war. They were always defined by their circumstances. But you seem to define yourself by something else. Something that sets you apart. Adrian tilted his head. I'm not sure what you mean. You carry yourself as though the conflict never truly hardened you, Cerelia said. As though you never lost sight of what mattered most. Adrian looked away, his hands gripping the rail. I lost plenty during the war. Friends, colleagues, people I cared about. It would have been easy to give in to anger. Sometimes I did. But what kept me going was the belief that we could stop fighting, that we could find another way. Her gaze softened. And now that the war is over? I'm still trying to figure that out, Adrian admitted. It's not like we just flip a switch and everything's fine. But maybe we have a chance. Maybe that's enough. Cerelia was silent for a moment, then said, You surprise me, Adrian. You see possibilities where others see only obstacles. It is rare, and it is something I value more than I expected. He looked at her, surprised by the personal nature of her words. I didn't think I'd hear you say something like that. Perhaps I am full of surprises as well, she said, a faint smile crossing her lips. Good night, Captain. Good night, Cerelia. As she walked away, Adrian remained at the railing, staring out at the stars. The conversation had left him with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. His connection with Cerelia was shifting, becoming something he hadn't anticipated. Chapter 6. Forbidden Affection. The dim corridor of the Thalaran embassy ship echoed with quiet footsteps. Adrian walked side by side with Mark, their boots striking the smooth floor in unison. The air felt cooler here, almost heavy, as though the walls themselves held the weight of centuries of history. Mark broke the silence first. Adrian, he said, glancing sideways, This whole situation, it feels like walking a tightrope. Yeah, Adrian replied, his voice low. But it's the only way forward. Mark shook his head. You think she really trusts us? I don't know if trust is the right word, Adrian admitted. But she's willing to work with us. That counts for something. They rounded a corner and stopped in front of a wide, arched doorway. Adrian placed his palm on the glowing panel, and the door slid open with a whisper. The room beyond was dimly lit, with a long, curved table in the center. Cerelia stood at the far end, her slender figure outlined against a wall of softly glowing panels. She turned as they entered, her expression neutral but her gaze sharp. Captain Cole. Lieutenant Hansen, she said, her voice calm and measured. You are punctual. We try to be, Adrian replied. What's the situation? Cerelia gestured to the table, where a holographic map of the star system shimmered in midair. The bright, swirling light cast shadows on her features, making her look both regal and otherworldly. A recent report indicates that certain shipping lanes remain vulnerable to rogue elements, she said. We must address this before it becomes a larger problem. Mark stepped closer, studying the map. Pirates? Not quite, Cerelia said. Dissidents from both sides, those who have not accepted the peace. Their activities are disrupting critical trade routes. Adrian frowned. Any leads on who's behind it? Several, but none that are conclusive, Cerelia said. That is why I have requested your assistance. I believe a joint effort will yield better results. Adrian nodded. We'll do whatever it takes to stabilize the situation. Mark glanced at Adrian, then at Cerelia. What's the next step? You and your captain will accompany one of our patrol vessels to the affected sector, Cerelia said. I will ensure you have access to all relevant data. Understood, Adrian said. We'll be ready to move out as soon as possible. Cerelia inclined her head slightly. Very well. I trust that you will handle this matter with the utmost care. Mark exchanged a glance with Adrian, then nodded to Cerelia. We'll take care of it. As they prepared to leave, Cerelia's gaze lingered on Adrian. Captain Cole. A moment, if you would. Adrian paused. Mark, go ahead. I'll catch up. Mark hesitated, then nodded and left the room. Once the door slid shut, Adrian turned back to Cerelia. What is it? He asked. Cerelia stepped closer, her voice dropping slightly. This mission is more delicate than I let on. The dissidents, they have connections within my own court. If their actions continue unchecked, it could undermine the progress we have made. Are you saying someone in your inner circle is involved? Adrian asked, his brow furrowing. It is possible, she said, but I have no proof. That is why I must rely on you. Adrian studied her carefully. You're taking a risk by trusting me with this. Perhaps, she said softly, but I have found that your perspective often reveals what others overlook. He folded his arms. What happens if we find out one of your own people is behind this? Cerelia's expression hardened. Then I will deal with them, but I must know the truth first. Adrian nodded slowly. We'll do everything we can. She regarded him for a moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Thank you, Adrian. He blinked at the use of his first name. It was the first time she'd addressed him so informally, and it caught him off guard. But he nodded and said, You're welcome. The moment hung in the air between them, the tension almost tangible. Then Cerelia stepped back and returned to the holographic map. Prepare your team, she said, her tone more formal again. We must not waste time. Adrian gave a short nod. Understood. I'll see you after the mission. As he left the room, his thoughts lingered on her words and the way she'd said his name. Chapter 7, Strength in Unity. Adrian stood at the tactical console aboard the Thalaran cruiser, Mark at his side, while holographic displays hovered in the air before them. The dissident fleet that had been causing so much trouble was visible on the map, a cluster of stolen vessels hidden in a remote asteroid belt. Cerelia's advisors flanked the Empress herself, but it was Adrian she addressed directly. Captain Cole, what would you suggest? She asked, her tone measured but carrying the weight of command. Adrian leaned in slightly, examining the positions of the ships. "We can't go in guns blazing," he said. "They'd scatter, and we'd lose any chance to neutralize them all at once. We need to cut off their exit routes." Mark pointed at the display. "If we deploy drones in these two sectors, they'll block the most likely escape vectors. That'll force the dissidents to cluster together. Once they're boxed in, we can use precision strikes," Adrian added. "Disable their engines rather than destroy their ships outright." One of Sorelia's advisors stepped forward. "You mean to leave them alive? They have already caused significant damage to our trade routes." Adrian glanced at Sorelia before responding. "Killing them won't solve the underlying problem. If we capture them and find out who they're working with, we can stop more attacks before they happen." The advisor frowned, but Sorelia raised a hand. "Captain Cole makes a valid point. Neutralization is preferable to eradication. Proceed with your plan." Mark gave Adrian a quick look of approval. "We'll need a skilled crew to pull this off. I'll coordinate with the Thalaran tactical teams." "I'll be on the bridge," Adrian said. "Let me know as soon as we're ready." Sorelia nodded. "You will have my support. I trust you will see this through." The operation unfolded like clockwork. Drones swarmed into position, their glowing forms creating a web of sensor disruption and false signals that funneled the dissidents into a narrow corridor. From the Thalaran cruiser's bridge, Adrian watched as their targets scrambled to respond. "Mark, how's it looking on your end?" Adrian asked over the comm. Mark's voice came through clear, despite the chaos. "The drones are holding steady. They're trying to break through the blockade, but so far, they've got nowhere to run." "Good," Adrian replied. "Keep them pinned down. We're almost ready for the disabling shots." Sorelia stood nearby, her gaze fixed on the tactical display. "Your strategy is effective, Captain. They are contained." Adrian nodded. "Now we just have to finish the job." The Thalaran gunners fired in quick succession, each shot targeting engines and power cores rather than critical systems. The dissident ships flickered as their energy fields collapsed, leaving them adrift. One by one, the vessels went dark, their weapons silenced. Mark's voice came through again. "That's it. They're done. Not a single ship escaped." "Excellent work," Adrian said. "Start prepping the boarding teams. We need to secure the prisoners." Hours later, Adrian and Mark stood in the hangar bay, watching as Thalaran guards escorted the captured dissidents off the shuttle. The prisoners' faces were a mix of defiance and resignation. Some glared at their captors, while others hung their heads in silence. "Well, that's one problem taken care of," Mark said. "Think we'll find out who's been backing them?" "I hope so," Adrian replied. "If we can trace this back to its source, we might finally stop these attacks for good." Sorelia approached them, her steps graceful even after hours of tense operations. "The operation was a success," she said, her voice calm. "You have done well." Adrian turned to her. "It wasn't just me. Mark and the Thalaran teams made this happen." Sorelia's gaze shifted to Mark, who gave a quick, somewhat awkward nod. "Thanks, Your Majesty, but I think Adrian's plan was the key." She regarded them both for a moment before speaking. "It is clear that when humans and Thalara work together, we are capable of achieving more than either of us could alone." Mark smiled. "I'll drink to that." Adrian shot him a look. "Not the time, Mark." Sorelia's lips curved into a faint smile, a rare expression that caught both men off guard. "Perhaps, Lieutenant Hansen, we will share that drink once this conflict is fully behind us." Mark blinked. Sure. Sounds good." Adrian chuckled. "Let's just make sure we've finished the job first." Sorelia inclined her head. "Agreed. But for now, you both have my gratitude. This is a step forward." Adrian nodded. "We'll keep moving forward, Your Majesty. One step at a time." Chapter 8. A New Future. The conference room was bathed in a soft, pale light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Adrian stood at the center, Mark beside him, as a holographic display showed the latest trade and security data scrolling past. Cerelia sat at the far end of the curved table, her posture regal yet relaxed, her dark eyes focused on the display. "So," Mark said, scratching the back of his head, "looks like the dissidents are finally out of business. Trade routes are back to normal." Adrian nodded. "We've had no new incidents for weeks. The shipping lanes are clear, and the data flow stable. The major bottlenecks have been handled." Cerelia's gaze lingered on the map for a moment longer before she leaned back slightly. "It appears the cooperation between our people is yielding the desired results." Mark grinned. "That's one way of putting it. If you ask me, we make a pretty good team." Adrian raised an eyebrow at him. "Don't get too comfortable, Mark. There's still work to be done." I know," Mark replied, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Just saying, it's nice to see things finally working out." Cerelia turned her attention to Adrian. "What of the remaining prisoners? Have they provided any information?" "Some," Adrian said. "Nothing groundbreaking, but enough to help us reinforce key routes and identify potential allies within their ranks. There's still some resistance on both sides, but it's dwindling." She regarded him thoughtfully. "You have done much to bring stability to this fragile arrangement. I must commend your efforts." "Thanks," Adrian said simply. "But it's not just me. Mark's been key in coordinating the ground teams, and your advisors have done a lot of heavy lifting. It's been a group effort." Mark nudged Adrian's arm. "Don't be modest, Captain. You've been leading this from the start." Adrian shot him a look. "Fine, I'll take some credit. But only some." Cerelia's lips curved into the faintest smile. "A wise leader knows when to share the recognition." Mark grinned. "There's a compliment, Adrian. Take it." Before Adrian could reply, the door behind them slid open, and one of Cerelia's advisors entered, carrying a small data pad. The advisor inclined his head towards Cerelia. "Your Majesty, the latest projections for economic growth have been finalized. It seems the joint ventures with the human colonies are exceeding expectations." Cerelia accepted the datapad and scanned it briefly. "This is promising. It suggests that our cooperation may continue to expand." Adrian glanced at the data display. "It's not just the trade. People are starting to talk on both sides. There's curiosity about each other's cultures, a willingness to learn. That might be even more important than the ships or the resources." Mark crossed his arms. "Yeah, I've seen it too. Some of the guys who used to hate the Thalera have started asking questions, trying their food, listening to their music. It's slow, but it's happening." Cerelia placed the data pad on the table. "Such understanding is the foundation of lasting peace. If we continue along this path, our peoples may truly coexist." Adrian leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "It's not going to be easy. There are still people on both sides who don't trust this alliance, who think we're better off apart." Cerelia met his gaze. "Change often meets resistance. It is the way of all things. But we have proven that it is possible." "Possible doesn't mean certain," Adrian said. "But we'll keep pushing, one step at a time." Mark nodded. "Damn right. We didn't come this far just to backslide now." Cerelia stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Then let us continue to move forward. Together." After the meeting, Adrian and Mark found themselves walking along the embassy's upper observation deck. The view was breathtaking, vast stretches of stars, the curve of a distant plain. Do we go from here?" Adrian thought for a moment before answering. "We keep building. We focus on what's working and keep chipping away at what's not. If we can hold this alliance together long enough, maybe we'll prove that it can work." Mark smirked. "You're always thinking 2 steps ahead. Me? I'm just trying to get through the day." "That's why we make a good team," Adrian said with a small smile. "You keep me grounded." Mark laughed. "Well, someone has to. You're too serious all the time." Adrian chuckled softly. "Maybe you're right." They stood there in silence for a while, the stars their only companions. Finally, Mark spoke again. "You think we'll ever look back on all this and think it was worth it?" "I think so," Adrian said quietly. "Even if it's hard to see now, I think it will be worth it." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, maybe you're right. Adrian glanced at his friend. You sound surprised. Hey, Mark said with a grin. You're not always right. Adrian laughed. But I'm right this time. Mark clapped him on the back. We'll see. As they stood on the observation deck, the vastness of space before them, they felt a quiet sense of purpose. The future was uncertain, but it was a future they would face together.